Everyone. Welcome to the Caucasus Through Time Network seminar series. We're very glad to see you here today, and for enthusiasm in joining us online. We know that many of you are still in the field, and we really appreciate your participation. So today is the network's pleasure to host a seminar dedicated to climate, environment, and society during the Holocene, a view from the South Caucasus. The challenges posed by climate and environmental change and the need to reflect on aware coping strategies as a human societies are, as you all know, a subject of really of daily discussion nowadays. And for these reasons, we find it especially important to bring to the forefront the contribution of archaeology and the natural sciences to understanding the dynamic relationship between climate and society for a long. We'll have the pleasure to hear from 4 experts about the methodological and archaeological underpinnings of reconstructing the history of past climate change, with examples drawn from the South Caucasus. But before we dive into the core of the event, I would like to share a few words about the network, especially for those of you who are joining us for the first time today. The network is a group of master and PhD students working in the Caucasus. The aim of the network is to bring together regional archaeological, anthropological, and historical debates and discuss current research carried out in the Caucasus. We are open to a variety of fields, including history, art history, anthropology, archaeology, medieval studies, literature, and historical and linguistics related to the Caucasus and the neighboring regions. The network is an inclusive and encouraging environment, and we put strong emphasis on uniting, transcending national boundaries, and enhancing a dialogue. Importantly, we provide a space for scholars to showcase their work and thereby facilitate scientific knowledge exchange. In the frame of that particular mission, the program today is quite rich and includes 4 presentations by 4 young scholars active in the South Caucasus. On behalf of the network, I would like to thank you all very much for suggesting such an intriguing topic for a seminar and for making this happen today. It appears to be particularly of relevance given the heat wave that is apparently hitting most of the continents now these days. So the seminar will unfold through 4 main talks. Each talk will be followed by 5 minutes of Q&A sessions. You may post your questions in the chat as the presentation unfolds, and we will do our best to address them during the allocated times. Keep in mind also that there will be a longer discussion at the end of the event for longer exchanges. Our first speaker will be Dr. Sébastien Joannin, who is a research scientist at the French CNRS with expertise in palynology and paleoclimate. His research focuses on the study of ecosystems dynamics in response to climate, environmental, and human impacts. Dr. Joannin has worked in the Caucasus and Central Asia since 2003, when he started successful collaborations with the Institute of Archaeological Sciences and the Institute of Geological Sciences of Armenia. His love for the region is not limited to academic research only, and in 2007, he even experienced the regional environment on the grounds as he biked from France to China through the South Caucasus for a total of what I've been told was 7 months. So that was quite an impressive endeavor. Dr. Joannin has covered many roles as scientific coordinator, and most recently is his participation in the ERC-funded archaeological project, Trans-Cause, investigating Pleistocene population dynamics in the Southern Caucasus. Welcome, Dr. Joannin. Our second speaker, Kristina Sahakyan, is a junior researcher at the Institute of Geological Sciences of Armenia, who focuses on paleontological studies and paleoenvironmental reconstruction at Lake Sevan in Armenia. She has been collaborating in the frame of the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft with the Technische Universität Dresden, the Institute of Geography and Steinman Institute of Geology, Mineralogy, and Paleontology of the University of Bonn and the University of Greifswald in Germany. Kristina will talk more in detail during the presentation about her own research, reconstructed paleoenvironmental records from lake sediments at Lake Sevan. Welcome, Kristina. Our first speaker, Amy Cromartie, is a PhD candidate from Cornell University who uses archaeological and paleoecological methods to investigate human environmental interactions around Mount Aragats in Armenia. Amy has worked in Armenia since 2014 and is a member of the Armenian American Project Aragats. Among her preferred methods are lipid molecular biomarkers, lake sediments, pollen, and macrocharcoal. Amy will talk during the presentation more about the intersection between social, political, and climate factors in influencing agro-pastoral land use during the Bronze and Iron Age in Armenia. Welcome, Amy. And finally, our last speaker, Mary Robles, is a PhD candidate at the University of Molise, Italy, who focuses on the relationship between vegetation dynamics, climate changes, and human societies around the Mediterranean basin through multi-epoxy approaches, which include sediment geochemistry, pollen, non-pollen polymorphs, and molecular biomarkers. For her PhD, Mary focuses on the study of two mountainous areas, one in the Lesser Caucasus, around Vanevan Peak in Armenia, and the other one in southern Italy, around Lake Matese. Mary will illustrate more in detail how multi-epoxy approaches contribute to the study of climate change and its impact on vegetation and human society during our talk. Welcome, Mary. Sébastien Joannin will actually be our first speaker and also a moderator for the rest of the event. And after opening the seminar with a talk on Pleistocene-Holocene environments, we will also guide the event as it unfolds through the next three presentations, including the Q&A sessions and the final discussion. So with no further ado, I leave the floor to Sébastien.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Anna Paola. So before starting, I would like to thank you a lot for organizing this this kind of conference, which is very new to me, but very interesting. And I also wanted to thank Amy Cromartie because she did work a lot for us to be able to present this topic, the environmental view of the context for human people living in the Southern Caucasus. So I'm moving to the screen. Thank you very much again. So just to mention, I'm a senior researcher, so in France, and I'm based in the University of Montpellier in southern France. So I wanted to mention that the work I'm doing is also linking to a bigger network, especially the scientific network for the Caucasus mountain region. And I'm working, as you said, now Paola, since 2003 in Armenia, but I'm also working as a palynologist in other places, mainly in the boreal ecosystems of Russia and Canada. I do also want to thank the fundings that help us to work, especially in the South Caucasus. And first, we had a long history of French international associated laboratories between France and Armenia. That is the funding that first made me to come in Armenia. Yeah, okay, I'm passing this. So I also want to share my enthusiasm working in the South Caucasus because it is a teamwork with our partnerships with our partners from Armenia, so the Geological Institute and the Archaeological Institute. And also we do now work with the Geological and Geophysical Institute of Azerbaijan and as well with the Institute of Botany. And here this network extends to now to the University of Uzbekistan. By the way, we have other collaboration in France, especially with the Mediterranean, la Maison de l'Orient de la Méditerranée, and Germany, and in the USA. And of course, the Geoscience Lab in Montpellier. So just to sum up, here in Montpellier, we are many people working with pollen, and for doing this, we search for sediment archives that are preserved in the landscape, where we do corings, and based on this, on the sediment that we we store in the fridge, we can do pollen extraction and then pollen identification using the microscope. And finally, we are able to transform the pollen assemblages that we found in the past in terms of ecosystems dominating along the time, and to see whether there are some vegetation dynamics and how we can relate this to different forcings. In Montpellier, we have a pollen extraction lab for doing this, and also we have a very huge pollen reference collection that has been that started to be built in 1945, and we have many pollen taxa from Africa and Asia. And this makes me think that I forgot to say that our ideas on the long term is also to help our young colleagues from the Caucasus country, and to form them for the pollen analysis and in some other biomarker analysis, because that's important to pass this to our colleagues. So what are the scientific aims in the South Caucasus? Here you have a vegetation map, and you can see that there are many different colors that in fact are related to different kind of ecosystems, going from woodlands to desert and semi-desert domains. So in fact, we have a very huge diversity of ecosystems, and we have also a high endemic rate for plants and also for animals. But what is interesting me here is the plant. And this is very important when we work in the Caucasus to keep in mind. One of the most intriguing thing is that we have a huge dominance of the steppes, especially toward the east. And there has been many questions about why does the steppe happen in the South Caucasus, and is it human or climate related? And in terms of climate today, here you have a map showing that this region is under influence of the westerlies that bring rains toward the east. And these westerlies, when they weakened or when the Siberian ice reinforced, are blocked. And so the weather become more arid. And this is very important because the blocking of the westerlies is usually what happens during the winter time. And then on the Armenian plateaus, at least, you can see that most of the rain happened during at spring, which is a very crucial period for the plant growth. Another aspect is the very strong geodynamical activity in the South Caucasus. Here you have a map with seismic activity recorded there, and here a map with some of the volcanoes that are present in the region. And again, there is a question about what impact this activity can have on the vegetation itself. And to finish, just to highlight the problematic when we are trying to link the environments that we reconstruct in the past and the human activity is shown here by this curve, which is made of the SPD in the South Caucasus. It was proposed by Palmisano, and you can see that human demography estimation raised a lot, starting from the Neolithic, so about 8 kiloyears BP or 6 kiloyears BC. And the last important thing regarding the vegetation is the introduction of agriculture and domesticated plants. So when we want to study, when we came first to study these problematics in the South Caucasus, we first look at the literature that was already existing, and you can see here a whole pollen diagram, which was done by Russian teams in the 70s, and these studies were had never been updated since that time. And for example, one of their conclusions was that the shores of the Sevan Lake were forested during the Mid-Holocene, and then that it tends to decrease due to human activity. That was their conclusion. So we revisited some of the site that we called lakes in Armenia mainly at first, to study the past vegetation there. And you can see here a figure which is coming from the article of Amy Cromartie published 2 years ago. And this figure shows, especially you have to follow the green curve, which is the forest curve. It shows that a long time here during the Holocene, the forest never developed much. Let's say not more than 20 to 30%. So the landscape was almost all open the whole time. And so the steppe ecosystems, coming back to the first aim I exposed, the steppe ecosystems were already present before even the neolithization of the South Caucasus. So we can already expect that these ecosystems are not completely linked to the human activity over the time, at least not their installation. Now, if we move to this figure here, you can see that we have a very strong climate transition between the early and the mid-Holocene. So this happened here around the 8.2 kilo-year age. And at that time, we had a very strong change in the different climate parameters that were extrapolated from pollen analysis. You can see, if you look here at the annual precipitation, we have a very strong difference between the early Holocene and the mid-late Holocene. And this helps us to mention that this transition was in fact a transition in terms of precipitation regime. Another way to highlight this is here the Zarechat core that express these changes in precipitation between the early Holocene toward the mid and late Holocene. And you can see that this happened at around 8 kiloyears BP, and almost at the same time as what is recorded in Central Asia. Here it was this study from Chen et al. In 2003. So there is a very strong and robust understanding of this precipitation regime shift that happened incidentally at the time of the beginning of the neolithization in the South Caucasus. Now, I will not enter into details into this figure, but it's a very recent paper published this year showing the pollen diagram extracted from the site, Calavan Lake, the Calavan Lake, sorry, north of the Sevan. And there are many illustrations of periods where the human activity seems to be recorded in the forest cover. Here it is this curve. You can see that it declined a lot during the medieval phase, and there are several kinds of these events recorded in the vegetation in this forested area. So it is a very strong, robust to compare the pollen. So the landscape description with the different phases of human activity. And just now to move back to the oldest time, the Quaternary time, you can see here in this reconstruction that the Caucasus was not much unglaciated. but during, for example, the different glacial periods of the Quaternary. But anyway, it is good to see whether the vegetation, how the vegetation was reacting to the glacial and interglacial changes that happened. And this was the aim of this study published in 2010, where from the pollen study we could disconnect glacial periods with a lot of open landscape environment and interglacial periods with more trees from the pollen analysis, and also from the botanical remains that were preserved in this section coming from the Vorotan Valley in Armenia. So I invite I invite you to if you want to have more explanation about the impact of glacial and interglacial on the first hominids coming into Eurasia, to read the different papers from Suzanne Leroy, who did work a lot on this question. One of the very recent results is coming again from the Calavan area. It's a collaboration with Ariel Malinsky-Buller. It's an archaeological context here from the Paleolithic, and it's interesting because we can work there with using pollen as well. And when we have when we see the description of the landscape, we can see a change from an open landscape toward a forested landscape. And this, of course, when we transform this into climate parameters, we see a very strong change in terms of precipitation between the bottom here, which is around the late glacial maximum, toward the Holocene. And so Anna Paula, you made the presentations already, but just to mention that Kristina will present you a part of a study from the Sevan Lake sediment. Amy, sorry, will present you the study from this region here near the Kasakh Valley plain. And Marie Robles is going to present you a study coming from Van Evan pit, which is just right on the shores of the Lake Sevan. And to extend a bit this toward the other countries in South Caucasus, we aimed last year to Azerbaijan to work on a sediment archive from this country, and this will be part of the PhD thesis of Luca Gerdil. And this will also be part of a larger project dedicated to the Caspian Sea area, and especially the arid circumcaspian, where we aim to work on vegetation and climate and the relation and its their impact on the human life ways, mainly in those different countries, so Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And I just thanking you for listening me with this map showing what you did at the beginning, Anna Paula. As a moderator, I should now ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, by Sandra, who was asking, the reconstructions were done using the MAT approach, MAT approach.
So MAT is means modern analog technique. So yeah, the oldest reconstruction that I presented were done using this method, but you will see today other approaches like WAPLS and random forest also, I think. So yeah, you will see different kind of these reconstructions based on pollen.
My name is Kristina Sahakyan, and I want to thank you for inviting me to this conference and giving me the opportunity to talk about late Holocene paleoenvironmental reconstruction using lake sediments from Lake Sevan, Armenia. So far, the knowledge about there is you see me? You can hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, sorry, my internet just stopped for a second. Yeah, the researches about past environment in Sevan Basin is very limited. So the purpose of this study is to present the possible changes of vegetation and climate of Sevan for the late Holocene period, and it's based on a sediment geochemistry and pollen records. Okay, so this research has been done within a framework of cooperation between the Institute of Geological Sciences of Armenia and Institute of Geography and Geology, University of Greifswald, Germany. The project is funded by the Euler program. And this study is one of the parts of my master thesis, which I defended recently. So to begin with, Armenia is situated in the south of Great Mountain Range of the Caucasus. The northern and eastern Armenia is bounded by Georgia and Azerbaijan, and from the southeast and west, Iran and Turkey. So about half of Armenia's area has an elevation of at least 2,000 meters above sea level, and only 3% of the country lies below 650 meters above sea level. The lowest points are in the valleys of Arax River with the elevation of 380 meters above sea level, and the Dibet River, which is in the north part of Armenia, and it has the elevation of 430 meters above sea level. So this is Lake Sevan, which is situated at the elevation of 1,900 meters above sea level. The water table area is equal to 1,278 square kilometers, and it makes 4.3% of the entire area of Armenia. The maximum water depth is approximately 83 meters. Therefore, Lake Sevan Basin represents the main strategic reserve of fresh water, not only for Armenia, but also for entire Southern Caucasus. So the lake is main factor determining moderate climate throughout the region. 28 rivers flow into the lake, and only one river flowing out is the Razdan River. Water salinity is about 700 milligrams per liter. So the structure of Lake Sevan Basin and bottom is formed by a system of active extension faults by shaping a few structures of a pull-apart basin. The pull-apart basin structures accommodate many quaternary and Holocene volcanoes, some of which erupted in the historical time. The west, southwestern, and southern part of the Sevan Basin are represented by the Geram, by Geram and Vartenis volcanic highlands, which were active since the late Miocene to Holocene. There is approximately 127 monogenic and polygenic volcanoes in Geram, only in Geram range. And here, for example, in the left photos, you can see the highest volcano of the range. It calls Ajdahag. Okay, so the northern and northeastern side of the lake is formed by an aphyolitic structure indicating Gondwana collision zone of an upper Cretaceous age in Maastricht. So the active faults display high rate seismic activity manifested both in strong earthquakes and in many smaller events. Median emission and geochemical anomalies have been recorded along the active fault zones traversing to the bottom of the lake. So during the periods of lowering the lake level, significant areas of the coastal strip with areas of fertile swamp soils were released, which were widely used in the economy. But during a further rise of the lake level, these lands were flooded. The peninsula in Lake Sevan turned into an island during the rise of the water level, and the maximum level of the lake was 1915 at that time. And it's fixed by transgressive sediments. They were dated with C14, and it's about 2,000 years before present. So after the artificial draining of Lake Sevan, which started in the Soviet period, the water level fell about 20 meters and the island transformed into a peninsula again. Yeah, so for paleoenvironmental reconstruction, 16 gravity cores were recovered from both small and big parts of the lake. It was in October 2021. The pollen samples were treated with standard Faegre procedure, which includes chemical treatment of hydrochloric acid, potassium hydroxide, and hydrofluoric acid. So all methods indicate a more homogeneous sedimentation in the lower part of the core and a more diverse succession in the upper part. That indicates possible intense water level regulations and anthropogenic impact. The magnetic susceptibility, which is done with Thorstein Haberzettel from the University of Greifswald, Germany, show the anthropogenic impact on the sample SEV 2116 here in the end of the right side. I don't know if you can see my okay. Yeah, so the sediment is mainly composed of white to grayish clays. Radiocarbon ages indicate a continuous and almost constant deposition during the past 4,800 years before present. So here 22 types of pollen were found, which were identified by family and genus level. And palynological analyses are showing the abundance of arboreal pollen taxa. So the lower, which corresponds to an age of 160, that shows abundance of charcoals. It dominates by herbs and mostly by Chenopodiaceae. So the comparison of the vegetation dynamic with one of the closest sites, which is the Vanevan core. The study has been done by Maria Robles, which she will present it a bit later. It shows the difference between a recorded arid event at Vanevan, which occurs at 5,100 to 4,800 years before present, and it indicates drop of trees of arboreal taxa. So, however, in SEV 21.6 core, we can see the abundance of arboreal pollen. In Vanevan pit, serial type of pollen also reaches its maximum at 4,300 years, and from 4,100 to 3,700 years follow strong decrease, which highlights a decline of agriculture. And from 2,700 to 2,400 years, a strong decline of Ceralia type pollen is recorded, and the last increase is from 2,800 to 800 years before present. So important data on fluctuations in temperature and humidity in Sevan Basin over last 2,900 years are provided by Grichuk. And the study is based on the results of spore pollen analysis of the outcrop of delta of the Zygnaget River, which is flowing to Sevan. So Grichuk established two epochs characterized by differences of humidity level and temperature regime in the late Holocene. So the first period covers the time from 2,900 to 2,600 years before present, and it continues to 1,750 to 1,300 years before present. It is characterized by greater moisture than the modern climate. And the second is characterized by the greatest aridification in climate for all subsequent time up to now. And the extreme phase was on 12th to 13th centuries. And also a similar result occurs around the Mount Ararat in Armenia. This research has been done by Amy Cromartie. She will also represent this next. So here at 4,700 before present, arboreal pollen taxa declines up to 25%. And even with this decline, the arboreal taxa remains high. Around 3,800 before present, the Chenopodiaceae here rises. sorry. Yeah, and from 2411 before present, increasement of Poaceae, other herb taxa, and arboreal pollen is recorded. Yeah, so briefly to conclude, sediments from Lake Sevan are ideally suited for paleoenvironmental reconstruction. They record more recent contamination, which has anthropological impact, for example, chrome mining near the shores area. Palynological studies show that samples which are corresponding to ages of 3,260 to 2,500 years, 1,770 years, and 1,080 to 850 years before present are dominated by pollen grains, which belong to three species, mostly dominated by Quercus and Pinus, and they indicate relatively humid and cold climate conditions. So abundance of charcoals in 160 years before present probably indicate a grassland fire. And this layer is also dominated by herbs, mostly dominated by Chenopodiaceae, and it can be indicator of aridification. And the pollen grains in all the samples are representative for a steppe vegetation characterized by a semi-arid climate. So that was it. Thanks a lot. And if you have any questions.
Thank you, Kristina. It's very nice to see this. So, does anyone have a question for Kristina? Okay, so there is a question, but for later, for the Van Evan core. Suzanne is wants to ask you a question. Please,
hello.
Suzanne.
Hello. Hello.
Hello,
everyone. Thank you for your talk. This is really an interesting pollen diagram. And actually, these high levels of arboreal pollen grains is quite interesting. And beside Quercus, you have a lot of Fraxinus. Do you want to comment on this? Because this is what makes your diagram standing out.
Yeah, sure. I will just connect the diagram. Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, we have just discussed it several days ago with Sébastien and Amy, the diagram, and yeah, so the fraction is the pollen grains are identified by the diagram by the pollen atlases. So yeah, it's just I don't know. They just were on the samples and I just identified it with the atlases.
Is it a gradient of vegetation between West Sevan and Southeast Sevan, or how do you explain the difference between this diagram and the one from the southeast of the lake?
So you mean this one, right, with the Van Evan core that will
yes
by Murray? Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, so here we can apparently see the differences because here I have more abundance on tree, and in Van Evan there is a high amount of herbal pollen grains. Yeah, so probably the it can be the result of the volcanoes that no, sorry. Yeah, so I wrote just I just read the literature, and according to Sahakyan, there was volcanoes in this period, and this probably can be a result of aridification in the southern part, but it also can depend on wind direction and so on. But the Lake Sevan was surrounded with the trees during that time, according to literature by Sahakyan and Takhtajan as well.
Thank you, Kristina. Maybe another way to ask somehow a similar question is when you look at your the most recent samples you have in your pollen diagram, does it match with the actual vegetation on the lake shores or at a larger scale?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Sébastien, for the question. Yeah, I would say, so nowadays, the modern vegetation is dominated by pinus trees, which were planted during the Soviet Union. But here you can, in the diagram, you can see that a very small amount of pinus, and I have, by the trees, I have a huge amount of quercus here. Yeah, and in the surroundings there are very less amount of quercus, but also according to literature, the quercus can appear on the place where it's even not planted. Yeah, so I would not say that it's completely the same, but there are not really huge differences of the modern vegetation.
Maybe the rate of trees is, I would say, a bit high compared to modern vegetation, but if we imagine the pollen grains coming from a larger scale, and especially from the forests that are on the east, on the reverse side of the mountain range, that's a possibility.
Yeah, also I have another answer for the previous question. Also the difference, yeah, between the two cores with this 21.6 and the core in Vanevan. The difference can also be that Vanevan is a pit sample, and 21.6 is a sample that that's coming from the right middle of the lake. Yeah, so the pollen preservation probably can be different as well. And also the ages, here you can see that in Vanevan core, the datation is up to 10,000 years, and it ends in 800 years. And my pollen is beginning from, in South 21.6 core, the pollen is beginning from 5,000 years, and it's end to 800, to now. So it also can be the reason of the diverse pollen.
Yeah, I have another question. If you look at the modern pollen assemblages, do you also have such a huge range and huge change between north, west, and southeast? Because the difference between the two types is very large. So is it also in the current vegetation and the modern pollen assemblages? Is it also so large?
Okay, thank you for the question. The modern pollen assemblage, the modern pollen, what I'm talking about is, yeah, you can hear me? Hi.
Yes, Christine.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah. So the more modern pollen.
We can hear you very well now.
Sorry. You can hear me now?
Yeah, we do hear you. But maybe Susan has also some problem of connection.
Yeah, sorry. So the modern pollen results that I'm talking about is taken from the literature. It's a different literatures. Yes, I didn't done it by myself. I've just yeah. So the pollen from the core, examine the samples from the core. Yeah, but according to the literature, there is a pine forest plantations in the nearby area. If I understood correctly your question.
Talking about these pines, we have this kind of planted pines.
Is there a huge climatic gradient between northwest and south? What is the climatic gradient between north and southeast?
There is not much a gradient, I think. Kristina, you want to
Yeah,
express on this?
sometimes the video is stopping, so I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question till the end.
Okay.
Just the difference, if I understood, between the northern and southern parts, you mean?
Yes, in terms of
Oui.
climate,
Is
if
there
you are
a
present.
northwest and south?
Yeah, okay, so also according to the literature, in the northern part, so the forestation was in the southern parts of the lake, yeah, from so mostly in Big 7 area.
So maybe we can restart this discussion in the end of today's meeting. So we will move to our next speaker, Amy, if you want, please.
Great. First, I want to thank the Caucasus Through Time Network for helping to organize this session and letting me talk a little bit about my research today. As others have said, I'm Amy Cromartie. I'm a PhD candidate at Cornell University and a visiting researcher at the Institute of Science and Evolution at the University of Montpellier. Today, I'm going to talk about my dissertation project and some of the work I have been doing focused in the Kasakh Valley of Armenia. My research takes an interdisciplinary approach to try to answer questions related to human and environmental history of the region, including humans' response to climate change, landscape fire events, and vegetation, all through the lens of agro-pastoral practices in the Bronze and Iron Age. A unique aspect of my research is I'm trying to move beyond simple correlation and environmental deterministic models and really understand how social political structures enact a change on their landscape. So here is the map of my research location where I have extracted multiple cores across a 10-kilometer transect here. And I've analyzed 4 in the context of my PhD. These cores all date to the Holocene, and for my thesis, I'm focusing on the Bronze and Iron Age context. These cores are at various distances to archaeological sites, which have been excavated and documented by Project Argos, which I am a member, and they're also at different altitudes, so I can understand more broadly how the landscape is utilized. But before I go into my results, I want to present my methods. First, I'm utilizing pollen and non-pollen polymorphs to detect vegetation change, pastoral pressure, and I'm also looking at changes in the wetlands. I'm utilizing the published archaeobotanical, zooarchaeological, and archaeological reports to understand the settlement and agro-pastoral history. I'm also using a molecular biomarker called branch GGGTs for reconstructions for paleotemperature. And lastly, I'm using macro charcoal remains to detect past fires, to reconstruct the fire history and compare it to archaeological fires to understand the relationship between humans with these landscape fire events. So here's the first results of the first pollen record I worked on, which was from the site of Shinkani and was published in 2020 in Quantitative Science Reviews. This record almost covers the entire Holocene and collects, and here we have select major pollen and plant species. We found that this area was dominated by grasses, particularly Poaceae, for the duration of the sequence, and has had very low levels of trees, which are seen here in green. And it also has high levels of Asteraceae, which are flowers from the daisy family. On the right, we have some pollen that could be indicators of human activity, and this is primarily made up of cereals. But a key takeaway from this record is that we actually have pretty low amounts of human impact on the record, because although we have cereals, these actually begin here much earlier than we have domestication in Armenia, and there are wild cereals present around Mount Argos today. So, but we do, even with this sort of low level of human activity in this record, this was able to challenge previous assumptions that this area was deforested in the Bronze Age by human communities. And instead we have a steppe landscape that is similar to what we have today. And if you see the picture behind me, that is that is the landscape today. To understand the human impact on the landscape, however, we turn to a record located a bit further in the valley. As you can see from the map, we have the Shinkani wetland that I just talked about, which is actually a little bit higher in the foothills. And then lower in the valley, we have the Nigavan wetland, which is closer to archaeological sites. Looking on this map at the left, which was produced as part of the Kasakh Valley Survey Archaeological Project run by Ian Lindsay and Alan Green, we have quite a few possible Bronze Age, early Bronze Age settlements here. And then in the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age period, we have more of a mortuary landscape with the presence of Kurgan burials. On the right is a satellite image of the Nigavan wetlands where we can see the evidence of archaeological sites directly south of the wetland. And you can see them right here. Although the periodization is currently unknown, some preliminary investigations by Project Argot suggest some evidence of early Bronze Age occupation. And one of the interesting things is that we have this sort of deep groove or canal that has been dug from the water's edge and leads down. You can see here in B, down to the agricultural land below. Today, this is cemented up, but this was most likely used in the recent past and perhaps even further in the past for rudimentary irrigation during periods of drought. So here is the results of our pollen record from the Nigavan wetland. This record is 8,500 years old. And this is, again, a selection of major species of pollen and non-pollen polymorphs. Specifically, we are using fungal spores in this record. What I found is that this core confirms our findings from Shinkani, that it has been dominated by Poaceae, aka grassland, with low levels of trees, again in green, throughout the sequence. However, unlike Shinkani, with a bit more of our taxonomic resolution of our pollen IDs, we found various species of plants correlated to periods of human activity, including polygonum species, which are also in our archaeobotanical records as crop weeds. And these taxa are marked here in red. And lastly, we have fungal spores, primarily Corpophilius fungus that grows on the herbivore dung and can be associated with pastoral land use. Moving into the periods of interest in the context of my thesis and periods of settlement, we first see some changes related to the Chalcolithic. We have very little evidence actually of Chalcolithic settlements during this period, but we do seem to have some fungal spores, which may be related to pastoral pressure. But we also have indications of erosion during this period, and this may be driving the fungal spores. However, we have sort of low levels of indicators that may be related more to agricultural crop activity. The early Bronze Age, we have higher levels of polygamous species, and then again, and fungal spores, and this again happens from the late Bronze Age into the Iron III periods. So in contrast to the Shinkani record, this record does show more evidence of humans modifying their landscape, although the Shinkani record is only a few kilometers away, but it is higher in the mountains. And this sort of illustrates that even within short distances, the different impact on the landscape by agro-pastoral land use can be quite striking. In the next section, I'm going to break down each part of this record and align it with changes in agro-pastoral technologies to understand how different social institutions and strategies may have influenced the pressure and utilization of the landscape. I'll do this primarily through macrobotanical data analyzed by Roman Hovsepian and zooarchaeological data from Belinda Monahan. The first permanent settlements we discover in the Kasakh Valley date to the early Bronze Age, and this is the first time we have permanent agriculture in this region. During this period, cereals make up 96% of the macrobotanical assemblage recovered from EVA contacts in the Kasakh Valley and the Sakhahovy Plain, and barley is 97% of all cereals, and there's very few weeds. The lack of weeds in this assemblage may indicate that cereals were held in high esteem during the EVA, and Hovsepian has previously noted that cereals were cleaned prior to being brought back to the site. When we look at the landscape change to the EBA, we see the increase of these arable weeds and the impact on the landscape through agro-pastoral processes, as seen here. The EBA in the Karaxes culture is typically defined by a lack of social stratification and a homogeneous material culture. However, this record challenges many narratives that suggest that communities without social stratification have a relationship with their land where their impact is minimal. Instead, increases in arable weeds and decreases in trees seen from pollen are most likely linked to increases in settlement, agriculture, and pastoralism. In addition, preliminary research, which is not actually present on the slide, from our molecular biomarker during this time suggests a climate event between the Caucasus I and the Caucasus II period. This is also recorded at the pollen record in Shikani with the disappearance of boreal species of Betula, and increased aridity seems to be present in regional lake isotope records. Although climate was probably not the only cause for the disappearance of the Caucasus community, archaeobotanical evidence and others have linked cereal agriculture with the identity of the Caucasus community. And if the Ka identity was linked to cereal agriculture, climate change from the Ka1 to the Ka2 may have led to changes in their identity and eventually sort of their disappearance. Although climate may have led to the decline of Ka, more information is fully needed to understand these transitions. However, after sort of a widespread abandonment of settlements and Ka communities from the South Caucasus and in the Kasakh Valley and the Sakhahovi Plain, we start to see a shift to more mobile lifeways in the Middle Bronze Age, where we see the large appearance of kurgan burials and horse carriages and increased social stratification. When examining the vegetation during this time, we see the return of trees here and a decrease in arable weeds. Although there's some fungal spores present during this period, there's very little evidence of human activity on and around the wetland. One explanation may be related to the mobility during the NBA. While the EBA communities lived more permanently next to the wetland, the NBA communities may have utilized the landscape more broadly. In addition, there is limited evidence of large-scale agriculture during the NBA, contributing to these less signals of landscape impact. This starts to change, however, during the Middle to Late Bronze Age transition, where again, we start seeing agro-pastoral communities returning to the Kasakh Valley and reoccupying previous sites occupied by the EBA communities. During this period, the LBA people again began to grow cereals, predominantly barley, but unlike previous period, there's more weeds in the archaeobotanical assemblage, assessing that maybe it was not held as in high esteem as during the EBA. But in the LBA, we start seeing a restriction of movement to the local landscape, which is recorded as increases in arable weeds and increases in fungal spores. This decrease in mobility is also recorded isotopically in the zooarchaeological record by Chizan et al. 2019, who notes the absence of long-distance seasonal movement recorded in the Delta 18 oxygen and strontium isotope records. And similar results were obtained by Marshall 2014, who looked at the isotopic records from human remains from the Kasakh Valley and found that with the 018 results that they were drinking from local water sources. So the impact and utilization of the landscape and decrease in mobility appears to have left more of an impact on the landscape. One of the things I propose that this may be because of the need for a more defensible space. So in the late Bronze Age, we see the emergence of political polities that may have been in conflict and the appearance of hilltop fortresses, which you can see here on these Google Earth images. The fortress is lying the mountains and interests of the Kasakh Valley and the Sakhahovi Plain. But we have the Negavan wetland here, sort of tucked back into the Kasakh Valley, which would have been in a better defensible position. And the fortresses would have been overlooking the plain. By these communities maybe moving into the Kasakh Valley and planting their plants and moving their animals in here and also utilizing this for transportation, they could have perhaps protected their resources from an attack from a sort of a neighboring polity. However, this did leave an impact on the wetland. This does continue through the Iron II period, which is part of the Awartian Empire, but the settlement history of this period in this area of Armenia is not very well understood. In the Iron III period, we again have archaeobotanical data that's very similar to the late Bronze Age, with a continual preference for barley, But when we look at the wetland, however, we see that pressure has eased on the surrounding vegetation and wetland taxa, but there's still indicators of agriculture and pastoral pressure. Trees are generally low in the Iron III period, but we do see them rebound a bit with oak, both at Shinkani and in the Negavan wetland. There's also decreases in arable weeds and other indicators. One reason for this may be low population density in the valley or moving agriculture out across the plain. However, when we consider some of the social political aspects, Cachadori in 2016 has suggested that the Iron III period, that these people may have, or they did live in subterranean dwellings at the Sakhahovy fortress, and this may be due to them hiding away from extractive governments, something that would have been felt during the previous Awartian period. If this is indeed the case, the Iron III communities may have utilized the foothills of Mount Argots more broadly, and some evidence of this exists at the core site of Shinkani, where we see increases of fungal spores at the end of the Iron Age, which were not recorded previously. Well, this could also be linked to some climate and fire events. We do see a suggestion of increase of pastoralism across the landscape during this time. Overall, we can see from these records how different social political structures can utilize the landscape and how social identities around cereals, pastoralism, along with an ideology about mobility can give us different impacts on the landscape. Overall, the Bronze and Iron Age communities gives us a glimpse on why understanding social structure is important when considering ecological change brought on by human communities. So that covers most of the Bronze and Iron Age and vegetation history. However, before I end my presentation, I want to highlight some of the things I'm currently working on, which will be published soon. Primarily, I've been working with a molecular biomarker called branch GGGTs, and these are utilized as a proxy for paleotemperature. It's based on bacterial communities and membranes that change their structure under different environmental conditions and have been found in a lot of different contexts, including soil, peat, lake, and marine sediment, and for the most part have a correlation with different environmental parameters, including temperature, pH, and precipitation. However, since it's a relatively new biomarker and method working with these in the wetlands of Armenia, we have run into some challenges, including the temperature signal possibly being overwritten a bit by sediment change. This has caused me and my collaborators to look at a few different ways to try to resolve this issue. And I have been working on this most recently, looking at it through two separate methods. One is by creating a local configuration based on soil, wetland, and lake samples collected from both published reports and samples collected in Armenia, which the samples are here. And I've been working with this with Mary Robles, who you'll see her presentation next. And overall, we've been able to get a good soil calibration, but this doesn't address the changes in sediment type. So therefore, I'm also working on an article that uses multiple machine learning algorithms and their probability estimates to detect these sediment changes. And so far, these results are fairly promising. And I think that they will be very useful in getting a very good climate reconstruction outside of the pollen record for the South Caucasus once it's completed. And just briefly, some of the other work I'm doing is working to combine the pollen data with reveals models from all 4 of my cores to get a regional signal, working with the macro charcoal. These are compiled from 4 cores to understand the fire history. And this is sort of the first results of the climate reconstruction, but I don't have time to talk thoroughly about that today, but you'll certainly hear more in Mary's presentation. So with that, I want to thank everybody, and especially my co-authors and collaborators who I could not do this research without. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's very nice again to see this study. Your Negavan record is very interesting. The huge correlation between vegetation change and human activity. So, do we have questions for Amy? I think there is one in the discussion. Jeffrey Summers is asking, is there good evidence for horses rather than other equids during the Coarax period?
You know, I'm not the zooarchaeologist. I know that a few horses have actually been found during the KA period, but it's not as much as during later periods. But unfortunately, I don't have the data to really to give you a good answer on that. But I do know we do have some evidence of horses during the KA.
More question for Amy?
So Amy, you presented a charcoal curve. And so I was wondering if you want to highlight this more, because it's quite interesting.
Sure, yes. I can go into this. And it's actually, I think, one of the things that I really have enjoyed about my study is that we are able to look at the landscape history. So this charcoal curve, we have periods of fire activity is above the line, and lower periods of fire activity are below the line, and it's a compiled Z-core scores of the charcoal accumulation rates across all 4 cores. And what we have here is mainly, I think it's mainly driven by climate, but we have quite a lot of grassland fires that occur starting really in the mid-Holocene and would be present on the landscape during the early Bronze Age. And it's something that the Caucasus communities, at least in this part of the Kasakh Valley, would have had to deal with. This then declines in the middle and late Bronze Age, and it's unclear right now if this is due to perhaps vegetation management or increases in pastoralism that's sort of suppressing the vegetation and the fires, or if it's climate. But we do have a severe change of fires. And then the last 2,000 years, when you look at your individual records, we have higher intensity fires, which I believe are human driven. So, so we have a mixture of climate and human influence on the fire history.
And just to follow this question about fire activity, there is the hypothesis that was developed by Robles and Turner, who mentioned the possible longer fire burning season, explaining the open landscape during the early Holocene. Do you see this in your records in Armenia?
I think the problem with it, particularly in this area, is that we don't have any Neolithic sort of settlements. It's more like Neolithic hunting sites. So it's really hard to correlate early fire activity with like the Neolization of the area. But there's certainly possible, especially with the evidence from the desert kite, where we have hunting, that they were using fire for hunting. But I think a lot more research needs to kind of go into those connections, and the chronology needs to be better sort of situated so that we know. But there is definitely could be a connection between at least hunting practices and fire. But I think we need cores closer to where we have more Neolithic sites to really understand the human drivers of fires during the early Neolithic processes.
Thank you. So
there is one question in the discussion. Sandra Gomez is asking, so she said, "Super Amy, really enjoy your presentation and the integration of different proxies. I'm just wondering how the temperature curve could be correlated with any pollen curve, example, trees, grasses."
Yeah, so we're also working with doing multiple reconstructions with the pollen data, which you'll hear more about in Mary's record, where we're using different transfer functions. And we have and that we have some precipitation curves, which I published with Shinkani, where we see increases of grasses that correlate with temperature. The increases of grasses with precipitation, the increases of trees and with temperature right now is still a little bit unknown, mainly because our temperature curves, at least from my site, are still being worked on. But I do think that we do see increases in temperature from the early Holocene into the mid-Holocene, and this does correspond with the expansion of trees, and also coupled with the precipitation, the expansions of more like tall grasslands during that period. I think I probably didn't answer that question as good as I could, but hopefully that sort of gives you an idea of what we're thinking about.
To follow this, you mentioned that the grassland are linked to precipitation, but here on your slide you have also a link between fire and, for example, poesy. So how do you explain this?
Well, so I think that this is a very hard thing to sort of untangle, but basically what we see is increases of precipitation that expand the grasslands, but then the grasslands are modified through our increases in fire. So there are you have the initial spread of the grasslands that are dependent on precipitation, but then the grassland fires are suppressing any potential trees for a while. And maintaining the sort of grassland landscape. And so they're sort of all playing together. And the fires are definitely linked to poesy. And this, when we look at like our length width ratio, we definitely see the burning of different kinds of herbaceous species rather than like trees. So. All right.
So, are there still questions? We have a few minutes
In front of us, so feel free to ask me any question you're thinking about.
And it also looks like Hannah was able to answer the question about horses when she's the zooarchaeological expert on our project. So she's the right person for that.
So as we have
Still some time, can you explain us why you can provide this diagram, which is a model of the vegetation cover, and just to mention why we cannot do it everywhere for Armenia, for example?
You mean the reveals model?
Yeah.
Well, so this is the compilation of 4 cores. It's actually, I'm sorry, 3 cores of pollen data. A 4th will be added later. And the goal of this is to sort of combine everything to get a regional picture. Because we're working from sort of smaller wetland context, we wanted to get an idea of the regional vegetation across this particular environment, and one particular small wetland maybe did not provide insight into the regional vegetation. And as you can see from my results from Shinkani and from the Negavan wetland, we do have somewhat different results, at least with human impact. So by sort of putting these cores together, we're able to look at what we have, I would say, regionally in the Sakhahovy Plain and the Kasakh Valley. And because our cores are within the same sort of regional constraint, we're able to produce this. And one of the things that the reveals model does is also it takes in account the basin size and the pollen productivity rates, and allows us to get a larger, better picture of the actual vegetation. And as you can see, our AP is actually lower than what we see in the sort of raw pollen diagrams, and our poaceae is a lot higher. So this really was a grassland steppe throughout the Holocene, and the main local trees that we have are oak and tilia, which is very small in our pollen diagrams. And so this would have been probably around the wetlands where the oak is today. It grows on the side of the hillsides and patches. So we definitely have a grassland steppe when we compare all of these together, but we're quite high. This is a higher altitude site.
Okay, so there is
Still 2 new questions in the discussion. So is there any indication of what of plants are present in the charcoal record?
Yeah, so we don't have the exact plant species, but we use the width to length ratio, which other studies that have been done in the savanna of Africa and also the North American prairies show that charcoals with a longer length ratio to width represent herbaceous taxa, where charcoals that are actually, they're kind of more square, but are almost equal length or width-wise are more from arboreal species. And when I contrast like my results to one of my colleagues who works in boreal forests, we definitely see differences between our records. So, well, I can't identify it as exactly grasses from the charcoals themselves. We do have a pretty good idea that it is herbaceous taxa.
so.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the organization of this meeting. So I'm Marie Robles, and I did my PhD between the University of Montpellier in France and the University of Molise in Italy. And today I'm going to present you a part of my PhD entitled Impact of Climate Changes on Vegetation and Human Societies During the Holocene in the South Caucasus with a multi-proxy approach. So the aim of this project is to reconstruct vegetation, human activities including agriculture, pastoralism, fire, silviculture, climate changes including trends or abrupt events during the Holocene around the lake Sevan located in Armenia. Considering the vegetation, the first aim is to understand the modern pollen vegetation relationship in Armenia. Until now, this type of study focused on Georgia or Iran, but no study has been conducted in Armenia. Then the aim is to reconstruct the wetland dynamics and the water level changes during the Holocene using different proxies. The next aim is to understand the Holocene vegetation around the lake Sevan, and more particularly, we will try to determine if the vegetation was steppic during all the Holocene, as it's the case for Shenkani and Zarechat, or if we had an expansion of deciduous forest during the mid-Holocene, mainly around the lake Sevan, as it's suggested by old paleontological studies. Concerning the human practices, the aim is to reconstruct human activities around the lake Sevan and try to identify human practices, the different periods and their impact on the environment. On the shore of Lake Sevan, humans have a long history, and agriculture is attested since 5,500 years before present. And we also know that the Lake Sevan was an important place, mainly during the Urartu Empire. That's why it's a site particularly interesting to study the human activities and their impact on the environment. Considering the climate changes, the aim is to reconstruct climate changes during the Holocene and try to identify abrupt climate changes and climate mechanisms. And finally, the last aim is to understand the relationship between vegetation, climate changes, and human activities at a local scale and a regional scale. And today, I decided to focus the discussion on the vegetation part and the human practices. So this study is centering on Armenia. On the field, we took a modern sample represented by the red circles. When we did a botanical relevé, we took mosses for the study of pollen. And we took a sediment core located on the southeastern part shore of Lake Sevan. Here we have a zoom on the Van Evan pit located here in red. And here we have the Lake Sevan. We can see the different archaeological sites in white around the pit. So in this study, we use a multiproxy approach, including XRF to determine the elemental composition of materials, pollen, which are gametophytes transporting reproductive cells and answering plant reproduction, non-pollen polymorphs or NPPs, which are spore of fungi, remnant of algae, and molecular biomarker, and more particularly branch digiti or glycerol tetraether, which are ubiquitous organic components synthesized by bacteria. And with this proxy, it was possible to reconstruct the catchment and wetland dynamics and water level changes, the vegetation dynamics with pollen, the human activities with pollen and non-pollen polymorphs, the climate changes with pollen and branch GDGTs. So the first aim was to reconstruct, I don't see, the modern relationship between pollen and vegetation in the Armenian steppe. So for that, we did an altitudinal transect from 800 meters to 2,700 meters. On this slide, we can see a diagram, including in gray botanical data, and in yellow and green pollen data. So at lower and middle altitudes, we have a semi-desert and steppe vegetation with the dominance of pollen of Chenopodiaceae and a large percentages of pollen of Artemisia and Poaceae. For the upper altitude, we see high percentages of Poaceae and a good correspondence between botanical relevé and pollen data. And we can observe pollen of Hippophae when it's present in the local vegetation. Finally, for the subalpine and alpine environment, we have a dominance of Poaceae, and we record few arboreal taxa representing the regional vegetation. So now I'm going to present the Holocene wetland dynamics for Van Evan pit. So on this figure, we have the data according to the age from the oldest to the most recent period. On this diagram, we have pollen and spore associated to the wetland and algae, including Pediastrum and Botryococcus. Here we have an estimation of water level changes, and here we have geochemistry data. So along the time, we observe decrease in water levels, and we have in the first time a lake system with high percentages of algae, including Pediastrum and Botryococcus. After, during the last 5,000 years, we have the development of peatland and the semi-aquatic vegetation, including Cyperaceae. We also observe a transitional phase marked by a strong drop in water level at 5,000 years before present and associated with a fire event. And then we can see the development of ferns. So now I'm going to present the Holocene vegetation dynamics around the Lake Sevan. So here in green, we have the shrubs and trees, and in yellow, we have the herbs. So during the early Holocene, we had a steppe grassland vegetation with pioneer trees such as Betula. And we see the other paleoecological study. We also had a steppic vegetation, except for several sites located in Georgia and Russia, where forest vegetation is recorded. So during the mid-Holocene, we had a mixed steppe vegetation composed of Poaceae, Chenopodiaceae, and Artemisia, and we have an increase of arboreal pollen taxa. However, Quercus here represents only 10%, and modern pollen vegetation relationship
demonstrated Quercus pollen could be recorded by up to 15%, even if no trees were present in the catchment. So a deciduous forest was not present on the slope of Lake Sevan during the mid-Holocene, as suggested by old paleontological studies. During the last 5,000 years, we have an open vegetation dominated by Poaceae. And at 5,000 years before present, we have fires, as I explained precedently, and we have several hypotheses to explain the initiation of fires. An anthropogenic cause with the litany of fires by the local population, a volcanic origin due to the nearby lava flows from Porak volcano, here in range on the map, and a climatic driver linked with a reedification period around 5,000 years. And then around 5,000 years, we have a large increase of Chenopodiaceae, which can indicate certainly a drier climate for this period. So now I'm going to present the human activities around the Lake Sevan. So here we have the pollen of Cerealia tip, which are used as an indicator of agricultural practices. Here we have the pollen of Rumex and Plantago, which are used as indicators of pastoralism activities. Here we have the human occupation around the pit based on archaeological data. And here an estimation of the population for the South Caucasus realized by Pelmisano. So during the late Neolithic and the Chalcolithic, we have an increase of pollen of Cerealia, but we don't have evidence of Neolithic occupation or agricultural practice around the lake. Agriculture during this period is primarily recording in the Ararat plain at lower elevation, but the presence of Cerealia tip pollen in your record may question the conservation of archaeological remains on the shore of Lake Sevan. Then during the early Bronze Age, here we have an increase of pollen of Cerealia. At this period, we have evidences of agricultural practices in archaeological data, and we have an increase of the population in the South Caucasus. During this period, the Kura-Arax culture is present in the South Caucasus, and archaeological data shows the development of permanent village communities and the development of agro-pastoralism system at any elevation in Armenia. During the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, we have an increase of pollen of Cerealia, and this result is consistent with the large number of archaeological sites around the lake, and we have an increase of the population for the South Caucasus. During at this period, the Sledge-Shen medinoculture is present around the lake, and the Urartu Empire appears during the Iron Age. At this period, we have the conception of forts, territory, politics, and the development of agricultural irrigation system and pastoralism. Finally, during the Antiquity and medieval period, pollen of Cerealia strongly increased, and it's consistent with the presence of archaeological remains located around the Lake Sevan. And this period is marked by the foundation of the Kingdom of Armenia. Considering pastoralism, we have very less evidence in pollen data. In fact, pollen of Plantago and Rumex are recording in very low proportion, but it's possible to say that during the Middle Bronze Age, the decline of agriculture is not accompanying in your record by a shift to a more mobile life way centering on pastoralism, as mentioning by Smith in your record. And finally, we reconstructed the climate with branch digitii and pollen using a multi-method approach. Here, I present the WAPLS data. So, and here we have an estimation of the water level changes for Van Even pit. So we detected 4 abrupt events, 2 cold and one warm, the 4.2. And finally, we observe a good concordance between the abrupt events here and the decline of agricultural practices here and here. And finally, our studies suggest a significant impact of these abrupt climate events on the local population. And your study questions the dissociation between human and climate from 4,000 years before present in the Near East, as suggested by several studies. So to conclude, this study is the first to investigate the modern relationships between vegetation and pollen in Armenia. The vegetation during the last 10,000 years shows a dominance of steppes, predominantly composed of poissé, and finally we don't have forest during the Middle-Eocene, as suggested by whole paleological studies. For the first time in the South Caucasus and the Near East, our study provides climate reconstruction based on branchidigity and pollen, coupled with a multi-method approach. So if you want more information about this part, don't hesitate to see the paper. And we identify 4 abrupt events, and we have cool conditions during the 5.2 and the 2.8, and warm conditions during the 5.2. And our studies suggest a significant impact of abrupt climate changes on population of the South Caucasus. So more particularly, it was possible to see close relationship between agricultural practices, archaeological evidences around the Lake Sevan, and population dynamics of the South Caucasus. And we identified 4 phases of agriculture separated by 3 arid phases. During the Neolithic and the Chalcolithic, we don't have archaeological evidences of agriculture for the moment around the Lake Sevan. And after, during the Early Bronze Age, Iron Age 1 and 2, and medieval period and Antiquity, we have a good concordance between archaeological evidences and pollen data. Finally, the study of pollen is maybe a key to study the beginning of agricultural practices around the Lake Sevan, and it will be really interesting to study with more details the cerealia pollen for this period, measure them to be sure that it's well cerealia pollen and not wild poissé. And maybe it will be possible to learn more about the beginning of agricultural practices around the Lake Sevan. So thank you for your attention.
Do we have a question for Marie? Could you please?
Maybe one question related to your slide 9. So you were showing the 2 mean annual temperature reconstructions. And for me, looking at the 2 different reconstructions, they are kind of, well, contradictory. So how would you explain those contradictions, and which one would you say is more reliable than the other?
Yes. So in fact, pollen reconstruction and branchidigity can have differences, and it's linked with the proxy. In fact, for the reconstruction based on pollen here, it was not possible to reconstruct the last 3,000 years because we had a very strong human impact, and it was not possible to reconstruct some part like here and here, because we had a degradation of pollen, and we had a high percentages of Chicorioides, so the reconstruction are not really good for this part. And for branchidigites, in fact, we have a strong correspondence between local dynamics and finally the distribution of branchidigity. In fact, we don't have the same distribution if we are in a lake or in a pit. And in this site, we have firstly a lake and then a pit. So it's not possible to compare this part with this part. And we can see some changes like here and here, and in fact it's linked with a change in vegetation, with local vegetation like Cyperacea or other plants. It's linked because with branchidigity, because in fact bacteria are the most of the time associated with the roots of plants. So if you had a change in the local vegetation, you can have a change in bacterial communities, and you can have a change in branchidigity distributions. So in the paper, I have a long part to explain the advantages and the disadvantages of each proxies. Yes, it's really not easy to understand the climate reconstruction when you use different proxies, but finally your interpretation is stronger because you can identify the period where it's difficult to interpret for each proxies.
Thanks very much.
So, who has question for Mary?
Can I continue with another one?
Yes,
Sébastien?
please.
So, looking at the charcoal record, you were pointing out that there is this big fire event somewhere in between 5,000 and 4,000. Is how many samples is that, and what kind of resolution did you determine it?
Okay, so I can share maybe the screen. So in fact, the reconstruction of fire was realized by Laurier et al. In a precedent study. And they did charcoal analysis. I don't know exactly the resolution, but it's, if I well remember, it's a good resolution.
But I mean, if you look at your pollen data, you can clearly see this peak in, what is it? The next one, close to Artemisia, right? Yeah, right.
Yes.
So, because that's probably related to the fires, right?
Yes, it's probably linked to a very low level waters. And at this moment, we don't have a good conservation of pollen. It's for that we have high percentages of Chicorioideae because it's difficult to degrade this pollen. So it's for that we have a high percentages, but it's not representative of the vegetation. And it was possible in my record to see a fire with geochemistry data. We had several geochemistry data. Like we had a peak of calcium and I don't remember exactly, iron, I think, calcium and other thing which can indicate fire activities.
So looking at the geochemistry, that would be the reaction for the fire, right? So you would have increased erosion from the catchment area, increasing mineralogenic input then. And then that's your line of argumentation saying, but did you determine the fire itself, like with charcoal or something like that in your record?
Not in my record, but it was realized by Laurier. In fact, it's we have it's a old paleological. It was a previous paleological studies, and but today the pit is exploited, and for this core, it missed the last 5,000 years. So that's why we did a new we took a new core, and it's this new core presented during this presentation. We have all the Holocene, but it's approximately at the same place, and it's easy to do the correspondence between both core.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So thank you again to everyone for listening. We can open the discussion. If so, finally, Amy answered the question of Torsten about the way to use the data set to determine reveals and z-score models. And Suzanne left, so I'm not sure I did really understand our question to Kristina. I think it was a question asking if there is a difference between, in terms of climate, between the north and the south of Lake Sevan, that could explain the difference between, in terms of pollen assemblage and especially trees abundance between the two records. So the one of Van Evan that just presented Mary, and the one that Kristina presented. So, but Kristina is not here anymore due to problems of connection. So just to answer, I don't think there is much difference because the altitude is very similar, and but there are indeed more trees in the north, especially in the valley. From where the river Zoknaget comes, but at the depth of the core that was taken for the study, I don't know. It's something that we need to improve and to have more resolution. Nice comment by Vincent. Thank you. So. Yeah, so Mary, you explained about ferns. It's related to the last question, yes?
Yes, so in fact, in my record at the moment, we have a large increase of the ratio silicium titanium, and it's probably linked to the increase of ferns at this period. And in fact, ferns have a large quantity of phytoliths. So, and phytoliths are constitutes with silicium. So we think that is linked with the increase of ferns.
Okay. So thank you. Maybe to have a more general discussion, as we focused on the human impact, the vegetation, the climate. Mary, you did not really detail the different factors, forcing factors in terms of climate for these rapid climate changes.
Yes, but I can share a presentation if you want, just to explain the atmospheric processes for this event. Okay. Okay.
Or you can make it already if you want.
So, okay, here we have the climate reconstruction for Van Evan Pit based on pollen and branch GGTs. Here we have the
full screen.
oui. Here we have the climate reconstruction for the South Caucasus, and here the climate reconstruction for the Near East. And I compared all these climate records to better understand the climate changes during the Holocene and try to identify the abrupt climate events. And in fact, we identified 4 arid events. The 5.2 and the 2.8 are characterized by cold and arid condition. And we suggest that is linked to weak westerlies and the reinforcement of Siberian eye on the Caucasus and the Near East. And for the 5.2, we suggest that this event is characterized by warm condition, and it's probably linked to weak westerlies and a reinforcement of Arabian subtropical system in this area.
Thank you. Yeah, so indeed it gives more information about how these atmospheric processes work together. So I don't know if there are any general question about the Anna Paola, if you please.
So yeah, if you don't mind, I mean, taking for granted that I'm coming in as a absolutely not expert on how you work, like your beautiful data and methods. So I think there are 2 words that kept occurring in your presentations. One is abrupt, and the other one is event. So my question for you is, what is an event in climatic terms? And the reason I'm asking that is because, like, especially in archaeology, we're so keen to correlate the changes that you identify with the changes that we identify, but that does not necessarily correlate in terms of scale. So I'm guessing that you're also dealing to a certain extent with the problem with resolution, right? Because you're kind of relying on other methods that have other issues with, I guess, chronometric resolution. But is this is an event, like, I don't know, is it a frequent occurrence of certain conditions? Is that how large can, like, how long can it be in temporal terms, and how short can it be in temporal terms in your understanding?
Usually the definition of an event is a momentum where the conditions changed, but then it goes back towards the previous conditions. So this is the definitions we use here, and it is different for example, to some climate change, that the conditions are something at one time, then you have this transition, and then you have other conditions that stay afterward. For example, I talk about the precipitation regime shift between the early and mid Holocene. So there is no return to previous conditions. So does it answer your question?
So it really depends. What you're saying is that it really depends on essentially what you're looking at. So because you talk more about like long-term, I guess long-term changes, but then like in Amy's presentation, we could appreciate a maybe more kind of short in term, if I may use that definition. I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe Amy.
Well, I mean, I think just like in the archaeological literature, even in the climate literature, there are sort of debates on whether or not something is an event or not. I will say that most of the time, like what we saw in Mary's record, are correlated to multiple records. So it's also required to things maybe seen in like a Greenland ice record or multiple records across a larger period. So the 4.2 event is kind of known more globally. Started with the research in Southwest Asia, but now that people have been looking at it, and this record has now been identified as a climatic event. But I think, you bring up an important point. We have sort of these abrupt changes in climate that can have impact on human communities, but we also need to think about the long-term scale changes over time, because these also have changes on how the human populations. So even though we can talk about these certain events that are maybe associated with larger events that we see across like the continent, we also have to consider how long-term changes, so like what Sébastien mentioned with the early to mid-Holocene transition, or the climate event I've kind of have seen as maybe a slower climate transition to aridity during the early Bronze Age, and how that also impacts human communities. Does that sort of help answer?
Yeah,
things?
thank you.
Okay. Mary, I actually have a question for you, if you don't mind. I know in your postdoc, you're going to be working more with identifying cereals, and you mentioned doing measurements on cereals. I'm wondering what other techniques you may propose that we work with in the South Caucasus and the greater Near East to actually determine if we are dealing with actual domesticated cereals or not.
In fact, it's possible to. In fact, we have different key to differentiate cereal with wild poissé, and we know that we can have problem with some taxa like Glycera, for example. But the most of the time we can sure that it's cereal when the size is under 50 micrometers.